of 90 Days to Increase Sales. I'm very excited because this is the one where typically afterwards I get a note from at least one participant saying, wow, I thought it was good up until now, but now it's really getting good because this is what I was waiting for. So tonight we're going to actually start talking about the sales process, and I believe at the end of the last session we kind of overviewed it, but tonight we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the sales process. I'm also going to make sure that I allow enough time this evening for questions or situations you're working on, because Greg already wrote to me earlier today, or maybe it was last night, saying he's got a selling situation that he wants to talk about. Maria also wrote to me yesterday saying that she had a question about something I had shared with her, and I suggested she hold it because it would probably be useful for everyone. So I'm going to dive right in. What you're looking at on your screen right now is what I call the typical sales process. This is the sales. It's a four-step process, and it's the way most training companies teach. It's certainly the way the training company worked for about 11 years ago taught sales. And the boxes that you're looking at stand for open. The O is open. The I stands for information gathering. The P stands for proposal or presentation, and the C stands for close. So in a four-step process, with the first step being open and the last step being close, the question becomes, what's the objective of each step in the process? And the answer to that is the objective of each step in the sales process is simply to move the sale forward and get to the next step. Now, most people use a four-step sales process, and it looks kind of like this in terms of how much time. This is just the steps, but this is about how much time most typical sales representatives spend on each step. And I'm going to share with you a little bit about how the typical salesperson sells, and then tonight I'm going to start giving you some ideas on how I would suggest you might want to have your sales calls to differentiate yourself from people and to be more effective. So the first thing is opening a meeting. The way most salespeople open a meeting is with some kind of a cheesy canned opening, like how about those Mets, or wow, it's really cold out today, and of course it is really cold out today, but those type of openings are designed to establish rapport, which is of course what you want to do in the opening of the sales process. You want to walk in, you want to meet the person, usually you shake their hand, you sit down across a conference table or a desk or wherever you are, and you want to get the conversation rolling. But the problem is you can't just get right down to business. You actually need to have a conversation before business that starts to get people to lower their guard, lower the barrier to sales that they have, because most people do have an immediate barrier to sales. It's almost like there's a wall in front of them when you walk in, and it's made of brick, and on your side of the wall they've placed a sign that says, I ain't buying anything today no matter what you do. So our job is to take down that wall brick by brick and make it so that they're receptive to what we have to say. And the way we do that is by not just getting right down to business. Most salespeople think that's what they want to do. Most prospects think that's what they want you to do, but the fact is if you just walk in and say, hi, I'm Mark Miller, let me show you what I've got, people's walls do not come down, and you're going to have a very difficult time selling. So when you use something canned, like how about those Mets, or cold weather we're having, or whatever else you use, and I could give you example after example of stupid things I've heard people say over the years, some of them incredibly stupid, down that wall, but it's not really breaking down the wall. In fact, if anything, it's making the wall stronger and higher, because everybody knows what you're trying to do when you try to establish rapport with how about those Mets, or you comment on the picture of their family, saying what a gorgeous family. It's like when I used to sell encyclopedias and we'd go into people's houses, and of course the first thing you'd say, oh, what a gorgeous home. Even if it looked like a piece of junk, you'd still say what a gorgeous home, and people know you're being insincere. So here's the thing. If you do not have anything better to say than how about those Mets, or wow, it's cold out there, then use that, because you have to do something to get the ball rolling and not get right down to business. But in a few moments, I'm going to give you something that I think will work a little bit better for you. In fact, hopefully a whole lot better. The second part of the typical sales process, information gathering, is usually a couple of very quick memorized questions, the answers to which most people don't care about. So we're going to ask a couple of quick questions. As a salesperson, we're usually not even listening because what we really want to do is get to the important part, which is where we present. See, when I ask sales audiences in person, of these 4 steps, what's the most important step? Almost inevitably, everybody says the C, the close. The close is the most important part of the process. And certainly, closing sales are important because if you don't close the business, you don't get paid. The prospect doesn't get what you want, what you have to offer, and you don't get what you want, which is their money and their business. So I say that for most salespeople, the close is the icing on the cake, and that what most salespeople want to do is present. We as salespeople love presenting. Now, for my friend Mark, who's more of an introvert and who's hopefully developing his introvert program, it may not be as important to you to be a presenter, but the typical salesperson loves to talk. They love to tell their story. In fact, they want to give every single point of light excuse me, about who we are and what we do. Each of these stars represents a different thing about our company and the product we offer and all the great things we do for people and all the ways we help companies like yours succeed better. This is what we call a product dump. It's also known, it's very good, Mark. It's also known as throwing up on the customer's shoes. It's not a pretty sight. It doesn't work well for them, and it doesn't work well for you. But the reason that most salespeople do what I call a product dump is because they're hoping that when they give you every bit of information about everything you could possibly know, that the customer, the prospect, will figure out what makes sense to them. The reason it's important to make sure that the customer figures out what makes sense to them, or at least somebody figures out what makes sense to the customer, is because, excuse me one second. Sorry about that. Because that's why people buy. People buy because it makes sense to buy. And that's so important, I'm going to repeat that. People buy because it makes sense to buy. In fact, I believe we all do everything we do because it makes sense to do those things. So it made sense to you guys to sign up for this webinar series. It may not be making as much sense as it did before you signed up. Hopefully it's still making sense, but it made sense for you to register for this. It made sense to me to offer this webinar series for you. I'm in sweatpants and a thermal shirt right now because I'm sitting in my house. After I'm done with this webinar, I'm going to walk my dog and then relax for the rest of the evening. I've been busy all day, but I thought that it was important. It made sense to me to be comfortable for the webinar because I knew I was going to be on the phone for an hour and a half. Some of you may still be in business clothes. Some of you may be in an office because it makes sense to do those things. In fact, I believe we do everything we do because it makes sense to do those things, including buy, and it's the same thing for our customers. They buy because it makes sense. So when the typical salesperson gives this presentation with all these stars, all these points of light about everything about what we have to offer, the hope is that the prospect is actually going to figure out the 1 or 2 points that make sense to them. In other words, the reasons that they'll buy. But here's the problem. The customer then knows what makes sense to them, but we don't, because we didn't ask the right questions. And when we don't know what makes sense to them, then that's what we have to move over to the closed column, and that's when we have to use 187 ways to close the sale. And I use that number because there used to be a book, I've heard it's out of print now, but there used to be a book called 187 Ways to Close the Sale, which was filled with closing tricks. The 3 devil close, the puppy dog close, the assume close, the Ben Franklin close, my personal favorite, which didn't work when Ben Franklin was alive, didn't work when I was selling insurance about 1 million years ago, and certainly doesn't work in today's market. But you had to know a lot of different ways to close the sale, and we used to call it power closing, how to really, it was also called sharp edging people, how to back them into a corner so they couldn't escape. It just doesn't work with today's more educated consumer, whether it's on the consumer or the commercial side. But if you don't know why the customer is going to buy, then you do indeed have to be a strong close. I know I just spent about 10 minutes telling you about how bad this process is, but here's something else that's interesting. This 4-step process works. This actually works. The reason I know it works is because this is what most salespeople do. As some of you know, I'm often paid by corporations to ride in the field with salespeople on appointments, and all I do is observe them. I watch what they do, I take notes, and afterwards, when we leave, we either go to a diner or sit in their car, and I tell them all the things that I think they did right and all the things that I think they did wrong. And sometimes when I'm observing salespeople and they're using this exact process, they close business. So I know that this works. However, I believe that there's a better way. And I call it the conversational sales process. And that's what you signed up for. The conversational sales process has a couple more steps. One of them is fairly optional, but the rest of them are similar but different. So I'm going to share with you my thoughts on how I think a sales call should be conducted, almost no matter what industry you're in, what product or service you're selling. And there are a few exceptions, but I think that guiding you through this is what you really signed up for when you signed up for this webinar, and what I believe will help you transform your sales to be far more successful. So if you remember, in the last process, we had the first step was opening, and here we still have opening and rapport building. It's the same thing. However, I'm going to suggest that rather than using some cheesy comment like, how about those Mets, or terrible weather we're having, or nice weather we're having, or whatever else you want to say, I'm going to suggest that what you want to do to really begin to establish rapport is to get people involved in a conversation about their favorite subject. What we want to do is we want to get our prospect talking about their favorite subject. Now, I'm often asked, well, how do we know what their favorite subject is? And that's the beauty of this. Everyone has the same favorite subject. No, it's not sex. No, it's not sports. It's definitely not religion. It's not money. Everybody's favorite subject is me. Everybody's favorite subject is themselves. Even people who say they don't like to talk about themselves like to talk about themselves, if you ask the right questions and listen effectively. So if you're taking notes, my suggestion would be this would be a great time to begin. If you haven't taken notes up till now, this would be a great time to begin. And if you're going to write down anything that you think that I think is important, here comes something important. The way I believe you should open a meeting is to get them to talk about their favorite subject themselves. And the way I suggest you say it are in exactly these words. I'm just curious, before we get started, how'd you get to be, and then fill in the blank with their title. I'm just curious, before we get started, how'd you get to be the, fill in the blank with their title. So in my situation, it usually sounds like this. I'm just curious, Mark, before we get started, how'd you get to be the CEO of Maria Co? I'm just curious, Maria, before we get started, how'd you get to be the Vice President of Sales here at Miller Company? I'm just curious, before we get started, how'd you get to be blank? The exception to this is if you're dealing with a committee, because you can't walk in and say to each person, I'm just curious, Greg, how'd you get to be the blah, blah, blah. I'm just curious, Mark, before we get started, how'd you get to be, you can't do that with a room full of people. And in that case, you would ask, I'm just curious, before we get started, how did the company get formed? And the interesting thing there is when the room goes silent for a second, everybody will turn to the decision maker and wait for them to answer, which is an easy way to figure out who you really need to focus on during the meeting. But typically we're meeting one-on-one, sometimes in twos, but certainly for a one-on-one, I start with, I'm just curious, before we get started, how'd you get to be the blank? And then you have to do the most difficult thing for a salesperson to do. Shut up. You have to shut up and listen. We're going to talk about listening skills down the line. Now, I need to break that down a little bit for you. I'm just curious is what I call a softener, and I'd like you to write that word down, a softener. A softener is a phrase that you put before a sentence, before a question, that softens the question. A softener is a phrase that you put before a question, which softens the question. The reason we want to soften our questions is because the key to selling is not giving a brilliant presentation, and the key to selling is not being a strong closer. The key to selling is gathering the right information. In fact, there are really three keys to selling. Gathering the right information, in other words, asking questions, listening effectively, and telling the right stories. The best salespeople in my 40 years of selling and observing salespeople are always the best question askers, the best listeners, and the best storytellers. And I'll talk about all three. We have to be great. Questions are the key to sales. In fact, I believe this. If you ask the right questions and shut up and listen to the answers, your prospect will tell you everything you need to know in order to sell them. Almost every time. So in order to be a great salesperson, you don't need to be a great presenter. It doesn't hurt if you're a terrific presenter, but you don't have to be. It doesn't hurt if you're a strong closer, but you don't have to be. But you do have to ask great questions. And I promise we're going to talk about what I consider to be great questions and what are the questions I think you need to ask, I promise. So because the key to selling is asking the right questions, we want to make sure that we don't turn our question asking into an interrogation. What we don't want is the situation to be like in a movie from the 50s where they're in a darkened room and there's a light shining in the criminal's face and there's a lot of smoke in the room and there's a detective with sleeves rolled up wearing a fedora going, "Where were you on the night of the 12th?" We don't want it to be an interrogation. So because we want to ask a lot of questions and a lot of different types of questions, we have to have a way to make it more conversational. And the way you make your questions more conversational, actually there's two. One is to make sure you put a softener in front of most of your questions, like "I'm just curious." And you want to make sure that you allow the other person to answer your question, turning it into a conversation. We're not looking for a monologue here. Now, other softeners, "I'm just curious," "out of curiosity," "by the way," "incidentally," anything that we put before the question which softens the question is what I would consider a softener. And personally, I use those four constantly. You don't even need any more, although you can probably come up with more of your own. And if you don't like mine, you should come up with more of your own. So that's why we're saying "I'm just curious." Before we get started, how'd you get to be the blah, blah, blah? The reason for "before we get started" in that sentence is when we say "I'm just curious" before we get started, how'd you get to be the Vice President of Sales here at HRA Research? Well, when I say "before we get started," it's kind of like the sales call hasn't begun yet. It's kind of like we're off the record here. It's just the two of us kind of having a chat before we really get down to business. So it tends to relax people. So we've softened the question by putting a softener in front of it. We're relaxing them and starting to break down the wall by saying, "Hey, it's off the record here. We're just a couple of people chatting." And then we ask them the question that's important, which is, how'd you get to be the blank, blank, blank here at your company? What I find when I ask that question is I typically get somewhere between 5 and 8 minutes of the other person talking about themselves, their resume. So I say something like, "Hey, I'm just curious, Phil, before we get started, how'd you get to be the Vice President of Sales here at Optimum LightPath?" And Phil goes on to tell me things like where he went to school and his first job and how he found it and where he went from there and whether he got recruited away or not and who he reported to and how that worked out. And then he decided to leave there and go to this other place and blah, blah, blah. And eventually how he got to be the Vice President of Sales here at Optimum LightPath. While Phil, or while the prospect, is doing that conversing, giving you their background and how they got to be who they are, you and I should be doing one thing and one thing, actually two things. First, we're listening effectively. We're using what I call active listening, and I promise we'll talk about active listening in another session, or we may even get to it tonight. We're actively listening to what they're saying, and we're encouraging them to speak more. We're encouraging them to continue speaking by doing things like gently, very slightly and gently nodding our head. Not overtly giving them a big nod, just a slight nod of your head like you're going, yeah, yeah, that's making sense to me. So you're slightly nodding your head. You're using your face to listen. There's a look that most of us put on our face when we're listening. So we're listening with our face, we're listening with our eyes, we're nodding our head, and we're saying things, gentle things, that encourage the speaker to continue speaking. Like, really? No kidding. How'd that work out? What made you do that? Tell me a little bit more. Little gentle things that gently prod the prospect to continue talking about themselves. Now, the question here is often, well, wait a minute. Why in the world would that work to establish rapport? Why in the world would that get people to start to like me and trust me? Here's why. When you ask people about themselves, their favorite subject, and you listen to them, you are giving them the gift of being listened to, which most people don't get in life. And I don't care what your title is. Most people don't get listened to that often. Even people who I sell to, like president, CEO, global god or goddess of sales, half the time people just aren't listening. If you're married, let me just ask you if your wife or husband listens to you very often, or your boyfriend or girlfriend if you're not married, or maybe both. If you have kids, how often do they listen to you? Dog? My dog trains me. So most of us don't get listened to very often in life. I'm actually in the enviable position that people pay me to listen to me. It's a good deal. But on the sales process, I have to listen to them. So when I'm asking you, and I'm actually listening to what you're saying to me about you, you start to feel good about me because I'm giving you the gift of being listened to. And subconsciously, you start to say to yourself, huh, this guy's all right. This Jeff guy seems like a pretty good guy. It's not overt. It's not like we're best friends after this conversation. But I found that this is the very best way to start the conversation and break things down. Now, I told you there are two things you're doing. You're using verbal cues to tell them that you're listening and to continue speaking. You're using physical cues like nodding your head. You're saying encouraging things. And the other thing you're doing at the same time is taking notes. Taking notes. When I go on a sales call, like you, I often have things that I want to show people. But when I arrive on a sales call, all that stays in my briefcase, under the desk or under the table, out of sight. I can't tell you how many times I've been on a sales call where people pull out all kinds of brochures and displays and pictures and all kinds of wonderful things, PowerPoint presentations, and they lay it on the person's desk or conference table or wherever they're actually meeting. Even if they don't open up that stuff, even if they just leave it in a pile and they do what I suggest they do, which is, I'm just curious before we get started, how'd you get to be the blah, 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 where's the focus of the prospect? Well, I promise you it's on that pile. What's in the pile? When's she going to show it to me? Why are we talking about this instead of that? Why did he put it on? He messed up something on my desk. Why did he move some stuff on my desk? By the way, here's a little aside. One of the things I love doing when I go on a sales call, if the meeting is taking place in the person's office, is I like to move them out of their office. I like to move them away from their desk. And the way I do that is by saying, if I was on a sales call and Mark was my prospect, I would say, hey, Mark, I've got some things that I'm going to want to lay out here. I don't want to mess up your desk. Is there someplace else we can go, maybe a conference room or something like that? Now, the fact is, I don't really care about messing up Mark's desk, but I want to move him away from his desk for a couple of reasons. Number one, Mark's desk is his battleground. And behind it, Mark's sitting in his big comfy chair like a general. He feels very confident and comfortable sitting behind that desk, like he's controlling me. And usually the chair that I'm in across the desk is lower and less comfortable. So number one, I want to move him away so he psychologically doesn't feel as in control. Number two, and this is probably more important, is that when at their desk and that little ding goes off when an email comes in, what are they going to do? They're going to look and see who the email's from almost every single time. And when the phone rings, they're going to look at the caller ID to see if whoever's calling is more important than Jeff, who's sitting across the table. I would like them to not have the distraction of their email and not have the distraction of the phone, if at all possible. It's not always possible to move somebody away from their desk, but I always give it a try. The third thing is, if I'm actually successful in moving them away from their desk, I've exerted some control. I've showed them that at the very least, I'm on an equal footing with them. I'm not looking to dominate people, but I also want them to know, hey, I'm not some kid who just walked in off the street who you can push around. And when you can move somebody physically to a different location, it psychologically, and I'm sure Mark could talk about this way more intelligently than I can, but psychologically, you're showing them that not that you're in charge, although in this instance you are, because you've moved them out of their comfy seat to someplace else. This is nothing that I'm pushy about. This is nothing that I think you should be pushy about or insistent about, but give it a try one time and do it where you feel comfortable. But you'll see that things shift when you move people away from their desk. So we have this opening conversation where I've hopefully moved you away from your desk and your distractions. We've started the ball rolling with, I'm just curious before we get started, how'd you get to be the blah, blah, blah? And then I want to go into information gathering. Mark, your question is, how do you say it to them? Is the question, I'm assuming the question is, how do I say to them to move them? If that is the question, yeah, good, thank you. So yeah, I simply say, hey Phil, I'm going to have some things that I'm going to lay out to show you, and I don't want to mess up your desk or move things around. Is there another place that we can go, maybe a conference room or something like that, where there's a big table? Just like that. Kind of like, and it's just like I thought of it off the top of my head. Hey, is there someplace else we can go sit? Maybe a big table or a conference room or something like that. I'm going to have some things that I'm going to lay out for you later on. I don't want to mess up your desk. And often they'll just say sure, without thinking about it. In which case I stand up, walk out the door with my briefcase, and then follow them wherever they're going. Now, I was telling you that when I walk in, I don't want to take anything out of my briefcase because I don't want them looking at that pile of stuff. But there are two things I am going to take out. Very good question, Maria. How about when they take me to a small empty table in their office? Yes, that's better than sitting at their desk. You've still moved them, and they're still away from their computer screen and their email and their phone. So yes, I would be happy to move to the empty. Will they still jump up if the phone rings? Sometimes. Will they still jump up and check their email if they hear it beep? Or in my case, when Godzilla roars, because that's how I know I've got an email? Sometimes, but you're way more likely to have their complete attention, and I want complete attention because it's unlikely that I'm going to have as good a chance of success in selling them if I don't have their complete attention than if I do. So I always give it the old college try. So I was about to tell you there's something else that I actually do have out when I sit down. So I'm giving them the verbal cues. I'm giving them the nodding of the head. The other thing I do have out is a pad of paper and a pen, and that's it. None of my other materials are out. I simply have a legal pad and a pen, and of course the reason for those are I'm going to take notes. I'm going to take notes from minute one. When I say to you, hey Maria, I'm just curious before we get started, how'd you get to be the president at, I forgot the name of it, I think it's Persuasive Speaking, or whatever the name of the company is. How'd you get to be the president there? As you're speaking, I'm going to start jotting down some notes. Now, when they're talking about their resume and their history and where they went to school and all that good stuff, you don't have to take down every note word for word. You're going to jot down some of the highlights. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I don't want you taking everything word for word because when you do it while they're talking about themselves, you seem like a stalker. Secondly, if you're writing, it's very hard to be listening at the same time. I'm not a big fan of the thought of multitasking because my belief is that your brain can really only do one thing at a time at any given nanosecond. So if you're writing, you can't be listening, or at least listening as effectively as if you're paying attention and not writing. So I want you to take a few notes because, A, the information that you write down there may help you later on when you leave and try to remember the conversation. There may be some crucial things that you write down. And B, when you take notes, the message you're sending the person that's speaking is, your words are important to me. The things you're saying are important to me. And Greg's asking, isn't it weird to take notes during a casual rapport-building gaining moment? No, I don't feel it is. So, for example, let's say I'm talking to you, Greg, and I say, so I'm just curious, before we get started, how'd you get to be the, whatever your title is at your company, at Rath Associates? And you might say, well, I was in college, I went to XYZ school, I'm going to write down XYZ school. And then I got a job at blah, 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 I'll write down blah, blah, blah. And then I may listen to you for another 2 minutes without writing down another note, but I'm just going to occasionally not write down a few things that may help me remember later on and also show you that I'm paying attention to what you're saying and I find what you're saying to me interesting. And for me personally, I find that having those notes later on really helps me come up with things that I can use in the sales process. Also, to things that I can use later on, because I put those things into my database. When I get back to my office, I'm going to enter that information. Also, when I'm talking to people on the phone, I'm jotting down notes and putting it in. Because I do things like, so let's say I'm talking to Maria, and she just happens to mention, you know, we get into a talk about how was your weekend. Oh, I had a party for my kid this weekend. Oh, what's your kid's name? And how old is she? Oh, how was the party? Blah, blah, blah. Well, you can bet that information is going into my database with a note for a year from now to remember to call Maria and say, hey, please wish your daughter a happy birthday for me. And I promise when you do that, Maria's going to go, wow, how'd you remember that it was my daughter's birthday? How'd you know that? I'll say, I don't know, we were talking about it a year ago, and I think you mentioned it to me. I'm not going to say it's in my database, but I can't tell you how often people say to me, you must have the greatest memory in the world, Jeff. You remember all kinds of little personal things. No, it ain't the case at all. What I do is I take notes, and I put that information in my database for me to use to my advantage. So I'm taking notes, I'm nodding my head, and I'm saying little things to encourage you to keep going. Maria's asking, what if I'm speaking to 2 people instead of a team or 1 person? How did you get to be the blah, blah, blah? Depending on the situation and how you feel about it, you might ask each of them. But you could also start it out the same way as I recommended for a committee, which is, gee, I'm just curious before we get started, you know, how'd the company start? How'd the company get formed? So either one would be fine with 2 people. When you get 3 or more people, though, you definitely want to go with the company rather than the person. But you just want to get them talking, and you want to be actively listening. Now, once we've gotten past that portion, we want to get into the most important piece of the entire sales process, which is asking questions, what I call conversational information gathering. So there's a couple of things we have to figure out. First of all, what are the right questions to ask? Second of all, how do we transition from the opening and rapport building conversation into question asking? Because you can't just jump in. So there's my little, I'm just curious before we get started, and one of my kids was looking over my shoulder when I did this and just couldn't be happier to see Curious George. So I'm just curious before we get started. And what we want to do is gain the right to ask questions, because we don't have the right when we walk in the door to go from step 1 to step 2. So we want to gain that right. And I'm going to suggest that the way to gain the right to ask questions is to get them to ask you a question. We want to get our prospect to ask us a question, and here's why I believe this is important. I believe that if I ask you a question and you answer it, you then have the right to ask me questions also, because I believe turnaround is fair play. So if I ask you a question and you answer it, you get to ask me questions too. Well, it's the same thing. If we can get our prospect to ask us a question and we answer it, then we then have the right to ask questions too, which is the only thing I'm looking for. I just want to be able to ask lots of questions. So the way I get my prospect to ask me a question is, when we're done with that opening and rapport building process, which typically sounds like, and that's how I got to be the blah, 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 blah. You'll know when their little story is ending. I then say, well, would it help if I tell you a little bit about Jeff Goldberg and Associates? You could also say, would it help if I go first? Would it help if I tell you a little bit about our company? Anything like that. The one I particularly use is, well, Mark, would it help if I tell you a little bit about Jeff Goldberg and Associates? Now, here's the beauty of asking that question. First of all, what's Mark going to say to me when I ask him, would it help if I tell you a little bit about my company? Well, he made an appointment with me to allow me to come in and chat with him about what I have to offer. So when I say, would it help if I tell you a little bit about my company, what could Mark possibly say other than, yes? I guess he could say no, but it's never once happened to me. The second piece of beauty about this is, when I say, Mark, would it help if I tell you a little bit about my company? He goes, yeah, sure, go ahead. In essence, he's asked me a question. Now, I actually force-fed the question to him. But in essence, when I say, would it help if I tell you a little bit about my company? And he goes, yes. In essence, he said, tell me about your company. So he's actually asked me a question without actually saying the words. I'm now going to answer his question. And then I believe in my mind I have the right to ask all the questions I want. And the way I'm going to answer Mark's question, which he didn't physically ask, verbally ask, the way I'm going to answer it is with what's called my brief commercial, also known as a 30-second commercial, also known as an elevator pitch. And I'm betting that right now Mark is smiling because, as the rest of you have probably heard me say a couple of times, Mark and I are in a networking group together, and Mark gets better and better and better at doing his brief commercial each time, so much so that last time I believe we applauded after Mark gave his brief commercial because it was so much more on target and so much more understandable to all of us. So too much pressure for Thursday. Yes, I understand. But yes, the way we're going to answer the person's truly unasked question is by giving them our brief commercial. In order for you to develop your brief commercial, what you want to do is figure out, how do I get the point across to the person about what we do, what I do or what we do, in a very short period of time, in a way that they'll completely get. So in other words, how do I answer their question in a way that they'll completely get without giving them too much? This is not the time to give them our full presentation. All we want to do is get to the point where they understand basically what we do. So some of the questions you want to ask yourself in order to put together your brief commercial are the ones that are on the screen. What do we sell? What is it that makes people do business with us? How are we different, or how are we better than the competition? And even though we're not the least expensive option, and by the way, this last one's my favorite, even though we're not the least expensive option, people choose us because. So I would like each of you to either write these down now or take a look at the recorded version over the next couple of days and fill in the blanks at the end of these, or answer these questions for yourself so that you can put together your brief commercial. And by the way, just as a quick aside, I apologize. It was only, I think, yesterday morning that I suddenly had the realization that I hadn't sent you the link to the recording of last week's session, or 2 weeks ago session, which is why you only got it today, and I apologize for that. I'll make sure that we get you tonight's session either tomorrow or at the very latest Thursday. I'm giving an all-day presentation out in Hauppauge tomorrow, so I'm not sure if I'll get to it, although I'll try even tonight. It should be ready. Greg's question, maybe you want to get to it later, but does this process change when the schedule is to meet for lunch, then get together afterward at an office for a presentation? No, as a matter of fact, the only thing that would change is you can ask that when you're sitting down to lunch. That's a great way to start the chat. And that's one of the two questions that I definitely want to get to this evening. Greg emailed me before and said he's having a different kind of a meeting than he's used to tomorrow, and he wanted some advice, but I think this would be useful for everyone to hear, so I promise we're going to get to that in a little while, Greg. So I'd like you each to be able to answer, what do you sell? Why do people do business with you or with your company? what makes you different or what makes you better than the competition, and even though we're not the least expensive option, people choose us because. Now, in a brief commercial, shorter beats longer. It's called brief for a reason. It's also known as a 30-second commercial. However, I have no problem if it takes 45 or 60 seconds. If you go seconds, something's probably wrong. You've probably got verbal diarrhea and you're telling more than is necessary at this point. It's also crucial, especially if you're networking, because your brief commercial can be used in the sales process, but your brief commercial is also used in networking. And by the way, when we get to cold calling in session 5 or 6, you'll see you're going to use it there too. If you're using it for networking especially, it needs to be easy for you to say and easy for the other person to repeat. It needs to be memorable. A coach that I work with suggested I read a book called The Microscript Rules by Bill Schley, and I urge you to pick that book up too. I think you can pick it up inexpensively in paperback. Bill says it's not what people hear, it's what they can repeat, and that simple makes us smarter. For example, Greg, you may be too young. Actually, half of you may be too young to remember melts in your mouth, not in your hand. But no offense to you, Mark, but I think you and I would immediately know that melts in your mouth, not in your hand is the catchphrase for M&Ms. And I'm not sure if, I don't think they use it anymore, although perhaps they do, but I don't think I've heard it. Oh, Greg, you remember that too? Good. Well, then they have been using it since I remember it, probably 20 or 30 years ago. If I said, please don't squeeze the Charmin, most of you, or some of you, might remember Mr. Whipple, even though the last time I saw that commercial was probably 30 years ago. If the glove doesn't fit, you must have quit. I think we're all old enough to remember, the OJ trial. So if you can make your brief commercial easy to say and easy to repeat, then from a networking standpoint, it's going to work very well. And the way I found out about that is I was sitting at a meeting with a coach that I was using in a fairly public place, and a gentleman came over and she introduced me to him. But she didn't tell him what I did, which I found odd. And when he walked away, she said, I want you to know that I know I did not tell him what you did. And the reason for that is because I can never remember the way you describe it. I can never remember the way you describe it. And the way I used to describe it, and I still use it as sometimes, is Jeff Goldberg & Associates is a sales consulting and training firm. We help companies to get more appointments with decision makers, shorten their sales cycle, and close more business more profitably. Excuse me. Now, when I said that to her, she goes, right, I can never remember that. And at that moment I said, oh my God, my brief commercial doesn't work. Because if the people that I'm sharing my brief commercial with in a networking group can't repeat it to somebody else, my brief commercial is useless. It doesn't matter that it made sense to me. I could say it all day long. If the people that I want to refer business my way, by talking to other people and explaining to them what I do and hopefully getting their permission for me to call them, then my brief commercial stinks if they can't get it out. And that's when I came up with the second sentence from the bottom, Jeff Goldberg & Associates, measurable and sustainable sales improvement. So you can see the first one is the full thing I just said to you. The second one is more in line with something that you may be able to repeat. And it seems that people are able to repeat oh, Jeff gets measurable and sustainable sales improvement. Even though it's a little bit of a tongue twister, people can remember that. Now, on a sales call, which is what we're talking about here, you don't have to worry about them repeating it. So on a sales call, my brief commercial looks more like this. Jeff Goldberg & Associates is a sales consulting and training firm. We help organizations like yours produce measurable and sustainable sales improvement. And the reason that part is right up front is because I want to catch my listeners' attention. And for the people that I'm selling to, the president, the CEO, or the vice president of sales, when I say I produce measurable and sustainable sales improvement, their ears pick up. They're listening. And then I go on to tell them the rest of what I do. We work with your sales reps and their managers to help get them more appointments with decision makers, shorten your sales cycle, and close more business more profitably. Everything we do is based on my personal 38 years of sales. Oh, I have to make that a little longer. 40 years of sales, management, training, and consulting experience. And when you combine that with my background in the theater and stand-up comedy, you get someone who's uniquely qualified to work with your team in a way that engages and entertains them while they learn to sell better. By the way, even though we're not the least expensive option, people choose us because when we leave, their team does get more appointments, does have a shorter sales cycle, and just plain closes more business more profitably. Now, when I've said that, the person sitting across from me understands to a certain extent what I do. They don't understand exactly how I do it, but they have an overall idea of what I do, and I've answered their unasked question, what does your company do? I then believe I have the right to start asking questions. And that's all I wanted to do from the minute I walked in. So once I've delivered my brief commercial, it's time to go into conversational information gathering. And the way I'm going to transition from the last word profitably into my first question is I'm simply going to put in a softener and ask my first question. So like this, does have a shorter sales cycle and just plain closes more business more profitably. You know, Bob, I'm just curious, how many salespeople do you have? Now, I'll explain at a later date why I would start out with that question. But at this point, I want to start talking about the questions themselves, because to me, this is the key to selling. The questions that we want to ask of our prospects and the questions that are going to make it far more likely that we're going to close business than if we don't ask them are questions that tell us what makes sense to the prospect. Because if you remember a few slides back, I told you that we need to figure out what makes sense to the prospect, and the reason people do a product dump in that big column under the P, tell everything about everything, is because they're hoping that if they tell everything about everything, that the prospect will figure out what makes sense to them. But because we don't know what makes sense to them and they do, we have to be strong closers. In this process, you don't need to be a strong closer, because what you're going to do is you're going to understand what makes sense to them. And if people buy because it makes sense to buy, then we need to find out what makes sense to them. Now here's the beautiful thing. And if you haven't written down any notes so far, please write this down. What makes sense to your prospect is whatever they're doing now regarding what you have to sell them. What makes sense to your prospect is whatever they're doing now regarding what you have to sell them. So in my world, I have to find out what makes sense to them regarding sales training. In Greg's world, he has to find out what makes sense to them regarding HVAC equipment. I hope I got that right, Greg. So we each have to find out what makes sense to our particular prospect, thank you, to our particular prospect regarding what we sell them. And the questions that we want to ask, not necessarily in these exact words, are, what do you do regarding what I have to sell you? Who is it that you do it with? Where do you do it? When do you do it? How do you do it? And why do you do it that way? And of course, what are you trying to accomplish? If you remember back to college, what do you do? Who do you do it with? Where do you do it? When do you do it? How do you do it? And why do you do it that way? That's Journalism 101. It sounds like you're being a reporter. And that's what good reporters do. They interview people. And that's what I want you to do. I want you to ask those questions, because when you find out the answers to these questions, you found out what makes sense to your prospect. And you want to ask these questions the present and the future. So just to give you an example, if I'm in Greg's office and he's the VP of sales over at Rath Associates, I'm going to ask him questions like, hey Greg, I'm just curious, how have you trained your people in the past? When somebody new, when a new salesperson comes on board at your company, do you have a training program in place for them? What is it? How do you do it with them? Where do you do that? Do you do that here? Do they go off-site? Do they go to some training program somewhere? Who do you do it with? What company do you use, or do you do this internally? Do you have an internal trainer? Do you use videos or DVDs? Do you take them to seminars? When do you do that? How about your people who've been here a while that you'd like to see improve? You know, they've been here a few months maybe, and now you'd like to see them get better. They've got enough product knowledge. You'd like to really increase their skills. Do you have something for your average performers? How about your top producers, the superstars? Do you do anything for them to make them even better than they already are, or do you just leave them alone? How do you do that? And what made you do it that way? And of course, I always want to know what they're trying to accomplish, because if people tell me what they're trying to accomplish, they're telling me how I can make sense to them. In fact, one of my personal favorite questions is, hey, Greg, let's say you and I agree that we're going to do business together. And notice I didn't say, hey, Greg, let's say you choose to do business with me. I always want to make it seem to people like I may not do business with you. And the truth is I may not. I don't take every client just because they want to give me some money. And believe me, I need money just like you do, all of you. But sometimes I turn clients down because I can see they're going to be a pain in the ass. So when I say, hey, Greg, I'm sorry, so I'm sitting in Greg's office, and I'll ask this question. Hey, Greg, let's assume that we decide that we're going to do business together, and we both choose to. 3 months from now, what will your people be doing differently, or what will your people be doing more of, or what will your people be doing better than they are right now? 3 months from now, what's it going to look like? And the reason I'm going to ask him that is because when Greg answers that question, 90 days from now, what's going to look different if you and I choose to work together? Greg's going to explain to me how he's going to judge my success or failure in working with his team. And when I know how he's going to judge it, I know what he's looking for. And when I know what he's looking for, that's how I'm going to sell him. So if he tells me, well, 90 days from now, if they're getting more appointments, I'll consider this a success. Well, you can bet my presentation is going to talk about how I'm going to teach them how to give more presentations and get more appointments. So I'm going to ask questions that allow me what makes sense to my prospect. I'm hoping this is tracking for all of you, because of all the things I could possibly share with you, I consider this to be top 3. Sales is all about the questions, and you have to be asking the right question, and you have to do it in a conversational way. I also want to make sure that you're asking questions in a way that gets you close to the truth. And the way we do that is by making sure we ask the same question at various times during the sales process in different words. We call those higher level questions, or second, third, and fourth level questions. So I might ask Greg a question about how he trains his people, and then later on, maybe 3 or 5 or 10 questions later, I might go back to the exact same question, just in different words. And the reason you want to do that is because the more times you ask the prospect the question in different words, the better they get at answering the question. And they bring themselves closer to the truth. Now, I want to just make a quick point here. There's a lot of catchphrases in sales, and one of them is, the buyer is a liar. The buyer is a liar. I actually don't believe that's so in most cases. Are there instances where people will lie to you on purpose to, trick you into doing something, or get a better price maybe, or something like that? Yes, there are occasions when that happens. But I believe most of the time, people don't lie to you purposely. They just aren't good at answering the question because perhaps they've never heard it before. It's kind of like the game of telephone. If you remember the game of telephone from when you were a kid, you sit in kindergarten or first grade or something like that, and everybody's sitting in a circle, and Greg whispers to Mark, and Mark whispers to me, and I pass it on, and by the time it gets back to the first person, the statement or the question has changed. Well, it's the same thing here. The more times we ask the question, the closer we help the customer get to the truth. In fact, if we all went on a sales call and one by one we walked into the room and asked the prospect the same exact question, and I went in first and Maria went in last, By the time Maria goes in, I promise you the prospect's answer would be different, assuming they didn't say, hey, the first 4 people asked me the same question. So the more times you ask the same question in a different way, the closer you get to the truth, which means the better information you're going to get. And good information allows you to make a good presentation. And I'll just preview that your whole presentation is going to sound like this. Here's what you're doing now. Here's how we can help you do it better. Here's how we can help you create a culture of motivation better. Here's how you do research now. Here's how we can provide you with better research, stronger analysis, whatever the value proposition is. So I hope that makes sense to all of you, because this is a crucial, crucial concept. Now, before we move on to the coaching portion, I'm going to just talk very briefly about listening and the 2 types of listening I believe there are. I believe that we listen in 2 different ways, active listening and passive listening. And I'm going to give you examples of both. Passive listening is the way most of us listen all the time. Listening like it doesn't really matter. Listening like you don't really care. Listening with half an ear. Listening like it goes in one ear and out the other. And the best example of this I give is my ex-wife, who, if you've ever heard me speak of her before, I adore. We're exes for a reason. But the example I love to give is, for those of you who don't know already, her name is Jackie. And Jackie used to come to me every Wednesday night between the hours of 9 and 10 o'clock to talk about something important. Usually there was some crucial question Jackie had to ask me on Wednesday nights between 9 and 10. And it was usually a question that sounded like this. You would not believe what Susie wore to work today. Brown shoes with a black dress. Can you believe that? Now, the first thing is, I don't know who Susie is. Second thing is, I don't know whether brown shoes go with a black dress or not. And the third thing is, I don't care. But the question becomes, why would Jackie come to me between 9 and 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night each week with something like that to talk about? And the answer is, that was when my favorite show was on, The West Wing. Now, if you've never watched The West Wing, first of all, I recommend that you bring it up on demand because it was a brilliant show, or get the DVDs or something. It was just phenomenal, incredibly well written, fast-paced, and you really had to pay attention. It was smart, a smart show. I believe that they either purposely mumbled or that it just recorded it low so that you had to pay attention. And it was the kind of thing that if you blinked for half a minute by doing something else, you kind of got lost. So when I was listening to Jackie while The West Wing was on, listening to her ask me a question about brown shoes and a black dress, it would kind of be like I'd be looking at her and looking back at the TV and looking back at her and going, what did you just ask me? And looking back at the TV because I didn't want to miss The West Wing. And actually, to share the honest truth with you, the thought in my head during that was, would God please strike one of us dead right now? And I hope that if it's me, that West Wing is on up in heaven. As you can imagine, and I hope you're giggling now because that's a joke, but as you can imagine, that's not a very good way to listen. It's certainly not good for a marriage, and if I had TiVo back then, it might have saved my marriage. But it doesn't do any good to listen that way. In fact, it pisses the other person off. Except I've observed enough salespeople to realize that most of the time, they're only passively listening to their prospects, and it's insulting. Active listening is much different. The way I like to describe active listening is by using an airplane analogy. Most of us have flown on an airplane way more than one time. In fact, I've flown on an airplane way more than one time. I've done a lot of traveling for business, so I've been on lots and lots of airplanes. But almost anybody who's been on an airplane more than once or twice or 3 times knows what happens when they close the door on an airplane. They come out and explain to you how to put on a seatbelt. And they point out where the emergency exits are. And then they point to the floor and they show you that in case of an emergency, lighting is going to light up along the floor. So in case it's smoky in here, you can just look down at the floor and you'll still be able to get to an emergency exit. and they tell you that in case of a loss of cabin pressure and the thing drops down from the ceiling, put yours on first and put a kid's on second if there's a child traveling with you. And don't worry if it doesn't inflate. The oxygen is still flowing through. And I know sometimes it's not a live person anymore. Sometimes it's a recording that drops down on, those little DVD players that they have every few rows or on a screen up in the front. And my question for you guys, which you can't answer because you're muted right now, but I pretty much know what the answer is. My question for you guys is, do you listen to that message anymore? When the flight attendants come out and they explain to you how to put on a seatbelt, are you listening? And I know that for most of you the answer is no. And occasionally there's somebody who goes, yes, I still listen. But that's rare. I can tell you for a fact, I'm not listening. I've heard this a zillion times. I could get up and give the instructions. And I can tell you this, that when the doors close on an airplane, I'm doing two things, and neither of them are listening to the flight attendants talk about how to buckle a seatbelt. When the flight attendants close the door, I'm doing two things, and those two things are, one, I'm typing very, 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 very fast, because I know any second now they're going to come over and make me put my laptop away. The other thing I'm doing is I'm praying. And what I'm praying for is that the plane actually takes off very quickly, because I know that the drink cart does not come down the aisle until we actually reach cruising altitude. So I'm not listening to that message, and most of you don't either. How imagine that you're flying from JFK to London, and halfway over the Atlantic Ocean, the pilot comes on with the pilot-y voice they all have and says something like this. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're cruising at about 550 miles an hour at 35,000 feet. The weather is clear, and we seem to be having a little difficulty. Both wings just fell off. Your flight attendants will now come out and review the safety procedures. Well, when the flight attendants come out, and I hope you're all applauding at that brilliant impression of an airline pilot. Thank you so much. I'm bowing in my office. When the flight attendants come out and review the safety procedures, which they went over at the beginning, I think you, and I know I, would be listening a heck of a lot differently. That's what I call active listening. Active listening is listening like your life depends on it. Now, on a sales call, does your life depend on it? No, of course not. But your livelihood does. Your business depends, and your paycheck depends on you actively listening to your prospects. So I urge you to start actively listening. And in a future session, I'll give you some tips on active listening, okay? At this point, what I want to do, since we've got 25 minutes left, I want to get to the questions. I don't know if the other two of you have questions, but I know Maria had emailed me a question, and Greg had also emailed me a situation. So I've unmuted your phones, and Maria, would you please come up with the question that you asked me via email? I think it was yesterday.
Yes. Can I be heard, Maria?
Yep, we hear you now.
Oh, okay. Even if we have a question about something you just said over the past 45 minutes?
Sure, let's go with that first.
Okay, because I do have a couple of questions. I'll make them really brief.
Great, please.
The thing that you've been talking about on a sales call, you mean it face-to-face, right? When you say call, you mean face-to-face meeting?
Correct.
Okay, and so it's not the one where they've received my proposal. It's the one first, the one where they don't know me yet. Right?
Right now we're talking about a very first meeting.
Okay, great.
We're going to talk about how to present a proposal later on. But
okay.
yes, we're talking about this is a very first meeting, the first time we're meeting somebody.
And then after you ask the great questions, then you say to the person, this is verbatim, here, so if I understand you correctly, this is how you're supporting, say, the influencing skills of your professionals now, and here's how we can help you to do it better. Is that sort of verbatim? In other words,
no, that's the essence of what you're going to say. Oh. But you may not use those exact words, although you might. Okay. But really, your presentation is going to say that for you.
All right. So the presentation happens in that meeting after you've gotten the answers to your questions.
Yes, and it may not be the same meeting. For me, it's not.
Oh, so in other words,
Go ahead.
okay, so the meeting could end there and you haven't done your presentation yet?
Correct.
Oh.
Correct. So I'll just give you me as an example. A first meeting for me takes 90 minutes. It's highly unusual for it to take less. And that consists typically of somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes of rapport building. And the balance of the time is, I'd say, of a 90-minute meeting, 5 to 10 minutes of rapport building, let's say 10. Probably 70 minutes of asking questions, and 10 minutes of me giving them kind of an outline of what I do, with me drawing little pictures and boxes that kind of, whoops, I lost my mouse, that kind of look like that. Actually, I show them this and that. And sometimes I'll show them how I teach cold calling, too, with more boxes.
So after you do the 70 minutes,
go ahead.
After you do the 70 minutes of questions, where you're asking questions, you show them something for about 5 minutes?
Yeah, 5, 10 minutes. It could be 15 or 20. I mean, these aren't rules, but the majority of the time is spent in a first meeting, for me, in a conversation about them and what they want to do. See, the important person here is not me. It's them.
So
the mistake that most sales... Go ahead.
So now those last 10 minutes, you're just briefly touching on what you could do for them, because you're going to elaborate later, hopefully.
Yeah, Maria, based on what you've told me, let me show you just a few things about what I think we might be able to do. And, of course, I'm going to have to go back to my office and think about everything we discussed, but here's some of the ways that I help salespeople. Like, let me show you what the typical sales process looks like, blah, 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 blah. And I'll give them the same talk that I just gave you guys, except a little bit quicker.
Oh, okay.
So I'm not explaining things as clearly. And all I want to do is I want to get them to see that I know my shit. Pardon my French for anybody who's offended by that word, but I just need to show them I know my stuff. But most of the meeting, we're talking about them.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Because you know who they care about?
Themselves.
Yeah. Now, I certainly can't walk away without showing them anything about me, because otherwise I'm not going to get that next meeting. But I mostly want to have them feel that they're the important person here, because they are, and I want to have them feel that I'm listening to them. Because you ever go to a party or any place where somebody's truly listening to you? That they're just listening. Your mouth is like a pearl of wisdom to them, and you know that they're maybe feeding you questions, and they just let you talk and talk and talk. You start to love that person. It's like, wow, I really had a great conversation with Maria. Except really, you let me talk most of the time.
That's great.
So,
Thank you.
Good.
That's great.
Now,
Okay,
would you please come up with that situation from yesterday?
Yeah, that was a quickie. I did the call. I left a message, and somebody called me back. I left a message, and I said I'm calling about. So it was an engineering firm. So I mentioned an engineering firm that I've worked with. So when the guy called me back, I did my whole spiel, and he said. You know, he said, when you told me that you were calling about, he said, I'm really very disappointed, actually, because when you told me that you were calling about T&M Associates, now I gather that you were talking about the work that you've done with them, and it was very misleading. I felt that you were being really deceptive, he said, and so I'm going to decline. Got it.
So what Maria's talking about is Maria and I have had some private conversations about prospecting by telephone because she had an urgent need to get more appointments right away, and she couldn't wait for that session, which is going to come probably a month from now. So I spent some time on the phone with her and shared some ideas, including how to leave a voicemail that gets people to return your calls. And Maria, without details, could you give me a rough estimate, just a very rough estimate about how many voicemails you've left since then and how many people have called you back?
Oh, yes. So
roughly.
I would say that, I'm looking at I've been keeping track.
Just roughly.
So I would say that Jeff's techniques are working. I'm getting a surprise. Every time somebody calls me back, I'm shocked. But, people in high places who are strangers have been calling me back. So.
And roughly, the percentage?
Okay. All right. So, okay. So.
No, don't even look, Maria. Just give me a rough idea.
All right.
Is it 1%? Is it 50%?
Oh, I can't tell you percentages. I can say that I dialed 51 times, spoke to 2 people, and got 4 return calls.
For how many messages? How many messages did you leave to get 4 return calls?
41.
So you left 41 messages and got 4 return calls?
Yes, is that good?
Well, that's 10%.
Is that good?
Well, you tell me, do you normally get 10%? Before we had that conversation about how to leave voicemails, were you getting 10% of your calls returned?
No, of course not. I'm telling you it works because I've gotten 0 return
Got
calls.
it. So you tell me, is that good?
Well, for me it's good. I don't know how good it is for other people's, for your standards.
You're so cute. That's good. Now, would I like to see you getting more return calls? Yes, I would. But if you were getting 0 return calls and now you're getting 10% return calls, that's a huge improvement.
Oh, good. Well, I'm thrilled.
So the technique that I taught Maria was to leave a message that sounds very briefly like this. And we're going to cover this for everybody, so you don't have to write anything down. We're going to go into detail about this. But the message would sound like this. If I was calling Maria, it would sound like this. Hi, Maria. This is Jeff Goldberg. My phone number is 516-608-4136. Maria, I'm calling you regarding Aramark Corporation. Once again, my number is 516-608-4136. And what Maria is saying is that when she left the message recently, somebody called her back, returned the call. She got him to call him back, but he was upset. He thought he had been deceived. So I will tell you that occasionally somebody will feel like they're deceived, especially if you feel that that is a deceptive practice, which I don't. Because I can promise you, when I call somebody, I'm dying to share the work I did with Aramark for them, or the work I did with Cablevision with them, or the work I've done with IntelliSphere with them, or the work I've done for any company with them, because that's how I'm building credibility.
Well,
that's what gets people to call back. So to answer your question, Maria, is how should you have handled that? I don't know how you handled it, but here's what I would have said. I certainly apologize that you feel I deceived you, but I've done a lot of work with XYZ Corporation, helping them to do exactly what you need to do, and I wanted to share that with you. Can we have a meeting? Will a certain percentage of people be upset? Yeah, they might be. They might be. But in my experience, the percentage is so tiny that it's well worth the risk. And if you take the number of times I've taught this to people all over the world, and the number of calls they've made and messages they left, and the number of times I get a call or an email from somebody that sounds like this. Hi, Jeff. My name is Boris. You trained me in Lithuania to leave the message. Somebody called me back, and they were very, very upset. Screw you. You suck. I mean, I could probably count that on 2 hands, less than 2 hands. And if you take the number of people I've trained times the number of calls they make and the number of times they leave that message and the number of people who actually get pissed off, it's minuscule. So you're making me laugh, Mark. So I love that technique, and I'm going to teach it to all of you, I promise. And look, you'll either be comfortable with it or you're not. You'll either try it or you're not, but it's how I get people to call me back. And
well, I'm very happy. I'm glad that you gave me the comeback for that, because well, so only one person is responding that way. I'm not going to stop doing this just because one person.
No, look, if everybody's responding that way, then what it means is that you believe that's a deceptive practice, and something will come across in your tone of voice because you believe it's deceptive. I've had people who, when I'm teaching it, say, no, that's lying. And then I'll say, just try it, and almost everybody reacts badly to it. Because subconsciously, you'll say something, change a word here or there, or just your tone of voice will show that you think it's deceptive. I don't think it's deceptive in the least.
I don't think...
And I promise you that I'm going to share this with all of you. And yes, Michaela, you're going to learn it too, I promise. And you'll either try it or not. You'll either be comfortable with it or not. But I can tell you that I get amazing results. I get 66% of the people that I call to call me back with that same technique. 66%. Remember who I call: President, CEO, Vice President of Sales. I got the CEO of Valpak to call me back saying exactly that. I got the president of Time Warner Cable New York City to call me back with that. Here's the exact message I left for the president of Time Warner Cable New York City. Hi, Bhupender. This is Jeff Goldberg. My phone number is 516-608-4136. Bhupender, I'm calling you regarding Cablevision. Once again, my number is 516-608-4136. Now, why would I mention Cablevision? Because Cablevision is a competitor, well, not really a competitor, but they're another company that does the same thing, just in a different geographic area. Now, why would Bhupender call me back after getting that message? He probably thought I was either from Cablevision and wanted to do some joint process with them, some joint business with them, or maybe he thought I was a recruiter trying to steal him away and take him to Cablevision. I don't care what he thought. What I can tell you is I got a meeting with the president of Time Warner Cable. And the same thing with the CEO of Valpak. I left the same message for him. Obviously, I mentioned a different company, and it's a guy with a different name, Joe Bordeaux. Hi, Joe. This is Jeff Goldberg. My phone number is 516-608-4136. I'm calling you regarding Newsday. Once again, my number is 516-608-4136. Newsday, a company that I've done business with. The guy called me back in 10 minutes. The CEO, the little blue envelope that arrives in your mail with thousands of employees across the country, the CEO called me back within 10 minutes. And I got an appointment, not with him. He turned me on to his VP of Training and Development, called the VP of Training and Development, and told him he should take my call because I can teach their people how to get appointments. So I promise you I will teach all of you how to do that too. Some people will occasionally be pissed off when you leave that message, but those were people, I promise you, you weren't getting meetings with anyways. So I'm going to move on because Greg has a meeting. We have 12 minutes left or 11 minutes left, and I very much want to give him some advice. So, Greg, would you please share with people the situation?
All right. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right. So right now what I'm doing basically is just kind of going in, the quick meet and greet. Hi, we offer these products. It's most of my meetings are like 5 minutes. Just, like I said, a quick meet and greet. But tomorrow I called up this one guy who I met at a show, at like a dinner kind of thing. He said to give him a call, that he would introduce me to his office. So I took him up on that, so I called him up today. And he said, all right, great. What do you say we meet up for lunch tomorrow? We'll get lunch, and then afterward we'll go back to the office, and you can, give us your spiel. So, like I said, this is very different from what I'm used to, and to my understanding, it seems like not a scenario where I'd want to be selling. It almost seems like just a casual thing, but I don't know any better.
Great. So for those of you who don't remember, Greg works for a company that is a distributor of HVAC equipment, so pipes and pumps and all kinds of stuff like that. Am I describing that accurately, Greg?
Accurate.
Good. And Greg and his company go into stores that sell these type of things, mostly the contractors, but it could be the general public walking in. So what Greg wants is for the store, the retail store,
actually,
to be...
I'm sorry, Jeff. In this scenario, I'm actually meeting up with an engineer, getting him to try and, tell the contractors to use our equipment. So this is, not so much like a sale, but like it's kind of the beginning process. If you tell the engineer, hey, you should use this stuff, then they'll tell the contractor, hey, we want you to use Rath stuff. It leads to the sale down the line. But
right. Okay. No, that's absolutely perfect. It's still the same thing that you want to do, though. So that's perfect. So you do also go into these stores, right, where contractors shop?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So this just happens to be somebody who we would consider an influencer, somebody who can make recommendations and who contractors would go to and say, hey, who should I use? Or an engineer who might say, hey, I want to use this kind of a product because of blah, blah, blah. So here's my recommendation for you. At the, do you know how many people are going to be at the lunch, or is it just you and this one guy?
Me and 3 guys, and I've spoken with the one for like, I don't know, 20 minutes with my father there as well. He was really doing all the talking because, they had more to talk about. So, and this was maybe about a month ago now, so.
Good. So, and they're all from one engineering firm, though, right?
Yes, sir.
Great. So if it was me at the lunch and everybody orders, I'd probably say, hey, I'm just curious, guys. I probably wouldn't say before we get started because it's not a real sales call yet. I'd say, hey, I'm just curious, how'd your firm get started? And let them talk. well, we used to do this, we used to do that. Let them just talk about it. And if they don't share it with you, you know, what did you guys do before? How about you, Bob? What did you do before you guys formed this firm? How about you, Steve? What about you, Joe? And just let them talk and kind of keep it very nice and light and easy and nod your head. I would not take notes at lunch. I would just kind of nod my head and just encourage them to chat. And you'll probably find some things during that conversation where there's some commonality. Maybe one of them went to a school that you went to. Who knows what might come up? And just keep the conversation kind of light and breezy. You know, you guys into sports at all? You guys excited about the Super Bowl? You know, just kind of. I wouldn't normally do the Super Bowl talk on a regular sales call, but at a lunch you need to fill conversation. And I would keep that going as long as I possibly could. At some point, either during the lunch or when you get back to the office, whoops, sorry, I'm clicked in the wrong place here. I want to get to this stuff. So I'm just curious, what makes you guys recommend one product over another or one company over another? Who do you recommend now? What type of questions do contractors ask you, or what makes you decide to recommend one thing to one contractor, one thing to a different contractor? You know, how do you make your decisions about things like this? And why do you do it that way? What else have you tried? What would really make your life easier? What would allow you to be more successful? What could a guy like me do for someone like you to help make your life easier? Those are the questions I would be asking, because once you know that information, you can then go, that's exactly what we do. Okay. See, my questions are designed to get information from the prospect that's going to lead me to say, oh, you want your people to get more appointments? What a lucky day for me, because that's exactly what I teach people to do. Oh, you want your people to close more business? Cool. I do that. Oh, you want your people to negotiate more effectively? You want the final price to be closer to the initial asking price? No kidding. I teach that as part of my conversational selling skills program. Isn't that an amazing coincidence? See, the more information you can get about how somebody does something and what they're trying to accomplish, the more you can tailor your presentation to. Unbelievable. That's exactly what we do. Isn't that cool?
So you're saying that, like, during the lunch, just keep it casual, right. the way you'd BS with meeting a girlfriend's friend, just kind of BS like, hey.
What a great way to put it. That's exactly the way I would do it. Because with the girlfriend's friend, you're trying to impress her without trying to impress her. You don't want to come on too strong, but you know the girlfriend's best friend is important. In fact, I was just talking about, who was I? Oh, I was talking about this to my kids the other day, how much I miss my ex-wife's best friend. Because obviously, you know, when my ex-wife kicked me out of the house, her best friend was no longer my friend, even though when we see each other, she's very friendly. But the reason I was telling that was I told my kids, and this is absolutely true, that before she would marry me, I had to meet her best friend. And she said, look, if Barbara doesn't like you, I'm not marrying you. And I'm like, okay, not that there was any pressure, you know, but I was doing my very best to make sure that Barbara liked me because I wanted to marry this woman. And it all worked out well. Maybe it would have been better off if she didn't like me, but that's another story. But, yeah, that's a great way to put it, man. You're trying to have a nice, casual conversation with them and get them to like you. You definitely don't want to come across as pushy. I definitely, over lunch, would not come across as salesy. In fact, I never want you to come across as salesy at all. I'd want to keep this light and easy. And as long as you tell me that they are going to take you back to the office, then I would try to keep most of the lunch casual and have this other conversation about casual stuff. And then when we get back to either towards the end of the lunch or when we get back to the office, start the sales conversation. Like, so what makes you recommend one company over another now? What would make your life easier? Those kind of questions. If it looks like they're not going to be inviting you back to the office, then you better get that conversation done over lunch.
Right.
But the thing is, if you finish the conversation over lunch, they may not invite you back to the office. And I would love to go back to, have you been to their office already? Is that where you met them with Dad?
No, we met at a, I think it was Westbury Manor.
Yeah, so it would be great if they brought you back to the office because, A, you can continue the conversation and have a longer time with them, and B, when people, one of the things I love to do is get a tour. I don't care where I am, I love a tour. Your dad took me around your place. I love a tour. Because when somebody takes the time to show you around, first of all, they're very proud most of the time of, this thing that they've built. And it shows that they care about you. If they're going to take the time to show you around, that means that they're starting to form a relationship with you. So the things you want to walk away with are, how can you help them? What is it you do? Why do you recommend certain people now? Do you recommend anybody now? Or do you just let your contractors do whatever they want? So you want to get in as much intelligence about how they make their decisions, how they make their recommendations, what would help them the most. And then you're going to want to tell them, that's exactly what we do. At Rath and Associates, we are committed to making sure that top quality materials and best pricing, or whatever the value proposition is. And I I met with your dad, but I believe you don't use cheap stuff, right? You only sell good stuff, and your prices aren't the cheapest, but you try to be very competitive. Yes.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. See, wow, pretty good memory for a guy who met your father, I think, a year ago.
I know you went back to your notepad.
I did not, actually. I'm still looking at my presentation. Your dad actually impressed me because he was a good guy, I often meet people who are very pompous, and your dad was just cool. Plus, I can also tell you, I forgot. Is it Bob, the VP of Sales?
VP of Sales? There's...
Or the sales manager?
There's John, Anne Marie, there's Carl.
I don't remember. So, I know I met with Anne Marie also, but there was somebody else who walked in kind of halfway through, and he just wasn't buying a damn thing I was saying. He was pissed off from the get-go that he even had to be there. But anyway,
it's got to be John.
That could be. Okay, anyways, but your dad stuck in my mind. Anyways, guys, that's what I would do tomorrow. And I don't care whether it's Greg or Teodoro or any of us, we want to keep it light and easy. We want to make it seem very conversational, but these are the questions we have to get answered. Otherwise, we're not going to be in a position where we can say, here's what you're doing now, and here's how we can help you do it better. Here's how you're helping your English as a second language people speak better now, and here's how, by working with, I'm sorry, Maria, what's the name of your company? Isn't it Persuasive Speaking?
It's not about English as a second language. Are you talking about me, English as a second language?
Yeah, I'm just asking the name of your company.
No, it's not about English as a second language. I help Successful Speaker, Inc.
Successful Speaker, that's it. That's all I'm trying to think of. I'm just thinking about that one situation where you're trying to help the woman communicate better, and
she happens to be from China, right?
Right, exactly. So it's just about, here's how you help people like that now. Here's how I can help you do it better. That's the whole thing, guys. All right, so wow, my clock just turned to 7 o'clock. I'm so excited that I'm actually finishing up on time. I hope that you found this useful tonight. I will absolutely positively get you the recording, maybe even this evening before I go to bed. It depends on how long it takes to process it. And if not, I'll get it to you no later than tomorrow night. In between now and 2 weeks from now, please, you are absolutely positively welcome to call me, email me with questions. I am here to help you. You've paid me to coach you, to help you, and I don't consider it just the 90 minutes we speak every 2 weeks. You don't have to, but I'm telling you I'm here for you. It's my pleasure to help. As always, I honor and appreciate the time and attention you've given me. I wish you a great night and a great 2 weeks, and I look forward to speaking to you all soon. Have a great evening.
Thanks a lot, Jeff.
Bye now.